Okay, and up next, let's learn how to manage remote data, which is a data stored on external server, straight from our React application. You see, so far in all our examples, we either used local data or fetched data from an API, also known as a server. And once the data was present, we continued to manipulate the data only in our front end application. Now, technically, there's nothing wrong with this setup, but there's another approach that we need to discuss, which is quite common these days. And that approach involves storing all of the data on a server and having the front end, so our React application, to be responsible not only for rendering data, but also manipulating data on the server with the help of HTTP requests. To answer your first question, why such approach is very common, especially for production applications, it's because in most cases, handling data requires a lot of resources. So if you try to do all of your calculations on the front end, most likely the end result is going to be that your app will be very slow. And in a worst case scenario, it will simply go bananas. Unlike the front end apps, servers, as well as the databases that are typically used on a server, are specifically designed to handle such data manipulations. So they do it much faster. As a result, our front end app is still fast and performant. Now, if all of this sounds like mumbo jumbo nonsense, don't worry. Just follow along with the videos and you'll see what I mean. As far as the topics go, during this section, we'll cover the most commonly used HTTP methods. So up to this point, we have been using only GET, but in this section, we'll also cover post, patch, and delete, the React query library, which has quickly become the go-to tool for server data management, and other cool things, such as the VS Code extension, which allows us to test our API requests directly in our text editor. All right, now that we have covered the basic theory of managing remote data, it's time to dive in and start implementing these concepts in our React application. In order to follow along, you'll need a star located in the 06 React query directory. So if you have already downloaded the main course repository and the directory is present, no further action is required. And you can move on to the next video. However, if you do not see the folder, you will need to get a hold of the repo one more time. And you can do this by either repeating the download step or utilizing Git commands. All right, and up next, I'm going to move this directory to my desktop since that is my preference. Keep in mind that, of course, you can work in the main folder, but I'm not going to do that. And if we take a look at our folder, we have one extra directory. So let me zoom in. Notice we have the final, we have the star. So same deal. This is where we'll do all of our work in the star. And this is if you want to reference the code. But since we will learn in this section how to communicate with the server, what do we need? Well, we need a server. And essentially, we have two options. We can have a remote server, essentially a server that is already deployed, or we can have a local one. And it's very common to have a local server while you're developing because the communication is much faster. You can work without the internet connection. And if you want, you can change some stuff on a server. However, in this project, I highly encourage you not to do that because I know that server works. If you have any errors on the front end, please just utilize the course Q&A. I can guarantee you that the bug is not on a server. Since I'm providing you a server, which I use to develop the front-end application, hopefully that is clear. And basically, the only difference between the remote server and the local one is the URL. So once you're done developing the application, you can deploy the server, change the URL on the front end, and of course, you can also, after that, deploy the front end application as well. Now, we're not going to do any deployment in this section simply because our server doesn't have the authentication, and therefore, anyone can pretty much come to your application and write all kinds of nonsense. So I didn't see the point of deploying the server as well as the front end. Okay. And once I'm done with my speech, instead of navigating to a starter, we will start with the server. So what's different about this section? In order to work on a front end application, we'll also need to spin up our server. And if our server goes down, let's say, if you come the next day and you forget to spin up the server, then your front-end application also won't work. Now, the setup is going to be very easy for the server. Again, I already prepared all the code. So you simply want to grab this sucker. Then you'll want to install the dependencies. So just open up the integrated terminal. Notice I'm located in the server. So we want to go here with npm install, which is going to install all our dependencies. And then we want to go with npm and start. And you can only follow along if you see the same message in the integrated terminal. Server is listening on port 5000. Please, if you have any kind of issues, bugs, errors, or something along those lines, utilize the course Q&A, and I'll help you troubleshoot the issue. Because, again, if the server is not running, you won't be able to do anything on the front end. And you can also test it in the localhost 5000. So if you open up the browser, look for 5000, you should see hello from server, and there's also a route which we'll use a little bit later, but I do want to showcase right away where we're going to go with localhost 5000, and I believe it was API and then /tasks. And here you should see an object with a task list, which is an array, and then we have few tasks. And if we take a look at our server application, I mean, you don't need to know any of this in order to follow along, but just to give you a general idea. So in here, I have a task list array. Notice I'm using the same library, the nano ID, and then I have some kind of title and whether it's done. And then in here, I have some routes that essentially manipulate this array each and every time we send a request with a proper URL, as well as the method, something we'll cover a little bit later. So for example, I can add a task, I can edit the task, and I can also delete the task. Now there's going to be two setups. Essentially, while we're working, we're going to work with this local array, which also means that each and every time you'll spin up the server, you'll notice that effectively we start from scratch. We start with this array. And then at the very end of the project, once we're already comfortable with HTTP requests and all of that cool stuff, there's also a different approach where we'll save those tasks in a local file. So that way, let's say if you stop the server and then spin up the server, you'll have the data from the previous session because everything is going to be nicely saved in your local file system. So that should do it for the server. Again, just make sure that you see this message. And also, I installed over here a library by the name of Morgan. Again, nothing that you need to be familiar with in order to follow along with the project, but notice how nicely we right away see what requests are we getting. So this is a GET request, and it goes to API tasks. Again, the main point here is following. If you see some kind of error messages, and you don't see this server is listening on 5000, or you cannot navigate in your browser to localhost 5000, please utilize the course Q&A because you won't be able to follow along with the project, since the main point of this project is to learn how we can communicate from our front-end application, so our React application, with our server. Now, since I don't want this window to be open. Again, we're not going to do any work over here in the server. I'm just going to minimize it. And then in the following video, we'll start working in our starter. All right. And up next, let's start working in the starter. So I want to open up a new VS Code. And I also want to grab this starter over here. And same deal. It's a Vite boilerplate application. So we simply want to go with npm install. And once we have all the dependencies in place, we're going to go with npm run dev. Now, in this project, we're not going to start from scratch since, again, I want to focus on the whole server communication thing. So effectively working with remote data. And you'll see what I mean in a second. So once you install all the dependencies, go with npm run and dev. And if you worked on the projects, this should look very familiar. So essentially, yes, this is our grocery bud application. However, in this case, we will work with the server. So at the moment, what you see is the local data. And of course, during the section, during this project, we will learn how we can flip from the local data to a remote data. And again, I purposely picked this project simply because we already worked on it. So we should be comfortable with this application since I want to hit the ground running. So I want to right away start communicating with the server since that's the main goal. I don't want to build all of this from scratch because there's a lot of things we need to cover. So I don't want to waste my time on setting up the form, setting up the list, and all of that. Now, I will give you a general overview of this application. So effectively, we have here app.js somewhere, app.jsx. So notice in here, I have some default items. So I just hard-coded this data. Eventually, again, this will be coming from the server. Notice I have the toast, something we already worked on before. So that's the React Toastify library. We have the form. At the moment, if you take a look at the form, there is no logic. Again, I'm just showing list of items. Eventually, once we submit the form, we will communicate with the server. And I'm sorry that I'm being so annoying and keep repeating that. But again, this is the main idea of this section, communicating with a server. So effectively, I want you to shift the focus from local data to a server data. Yes, at the moment, it's hard-coded in the app.jsx, but eventually, all of this is going to be dynamic. So in the form, I have some local variable with useState. Initially, the value is empty. I have onSubmit. Notice I just have prevent default. Then form control, the input, the value is equal to my state value. I have onChange. So each and every time I'm typing something, of course, I'm updating the state value, which in turn displays that in the input. And of course, I have the submit button as well. Again, back in the app.jsx, we have these default items. So I have this array and I'm passing it down to a items. And you can probably already guess what we're doing in the items. I grab the items prop, I iterate over, and for every item, I return an item and I pass it over here. And of course, I use the ID as well. And then in a single item, we grab the item and in there we have is done property. So I just use it for my checkbox. Again, notice onChange is empty. I just have the console log. Then I display the item title. And also there is a remove button, which doesn't do anything. And of course, there's also a README where you'll find all of the steps. And one thing that I just want to mention, if you're interested in learning how to build the server, which we're going to use all throughout the section, we cover that in my Node tutorial and projects course. And with this in place, I believe we have covered pretty much the first 4 steps. And up next, we can start working on our front-end application. All right, and let's right away start with the challenge. Since in the previous section, we covered Axios library, and it is one of the dependencies. So I already installed library. You don't have to worry about that. What I do want you to set up is the custom instance. So remember, with Axios, we can create a custom instance and we can provide some default properties. So in this case, I want to create that custom instance and I want to set up the base URL. And this is the value that I want you to set up. And before I do that, let me showcase essentially why we would want to do that. So if I navigate back to the server, you'll notice something interesting. You'll notice that I have the home route. So this is just used so we can see that the server is working. But then after that, pretty much each and every time I want to do something with my tasks, whether that is to read the tasks or add a new task, the route starts with /API and then tasks. And before you ask, yes, it's the same URL, but the methods are different. And we'll discuss that in a second. So for now, let's just focus on the URL part. So it starts with API tasks. And then, for example, if I want to update, I go with API tasks. And in order to update, what do I need? Well, I need to know which specific task we're going to be updating, correct? Otherwise, it's like, well, I'm updating the last task, but it's actually updating the first one. That's not what we want. And therefore, in here, we also have the ID. And the same goes if we want to delete. Again, we start with API tasks, and then we provide the ID. Now, why such approach is common on the servers? Well, because typically there's a bunch of resources on a server. So you need to set up some kind of structure. And if you're looking for an official name, this is called REST API pattern. But again, that's not something that we really need to focus on right now. We just need to understand that even though the actual URL might differ, this type of approach where we have some kind of base URL, it's common when you're working with the servers. And if this is a local server, we start with localhost and then API and then tasks. And if it's a production one, then of course you go with the full URL and then you just add this API and tasks. So hopefully this is clear. So now let's navigate back to our project. And now we want to set up that custom instance. Now, of course, you can type the HTTP part and localhost and all that, but I just want to show you a nice trick where essentially, if you navigate to a browser and if you already opened localhost 5000 and then API tasks, you can just simply copy the URL. So that way you know for sure that the URL is correct and you can avoid some typos. So I copied the value and back in the source, let me just double check. Yep, everything is working. I want to create a utils folder, or I'm sorry, utils file. It's more correct. And in my case, I'm going to go with JS. And here we want to start by importing the Axios from an Axios library. And after that, I want to set up that custom instance. As always, name is really up to you. I'm going to go with custom fetch. And that will be equal to axios.create. And then we pass in the object. So essentially, we'll go with base URL. That's the property. And now I just want to pass in the value. And to answer your question, why this is so useful on the front end, well, think about it. If you know that you'll be setting up requests to the server and each and every time the URL is going to start with these values, what is easier? To set up one custom instance or each and every time type HTTP, then localhost, and then API tasks. Now, of course, you can make an argument that you can store this in the variable and then reuse it all throughout your project. But keep in mind that when it comes to custom instance, not only you'll have base URL, you'll have some additional things in that custom instance, which again, we're not using in this project, but normally you have them. And therefore, if you're already setting up those properties, you might as well set up the base URL. Hopefully it is clear. And now let's go with export, then default, and we're looking for custom fetch. Let's save it. We're not going to test anything. If there's going to be a bug, of course, we'll come back and we'll fix it. And once we have our custom instance in place, we can move on to the next step. Okay, and up next, let's talk about HTTP methods. And essentially, HTTP methods define the types of actions that can be performed on a web server. For example, we can retrieve, modify, or delete information. And before we take a look at the methods, I just want to mention that in my examples, I used Axios and I used the async await approach just because I find it more straightforward. But please keep in mind that, of course, we can perform the same actions with fetch. You'll just have to write more code, or you can use .then approach. So when it comes to Axios, it returns a promise, and either you can stick await in front of it, or you can chain .then. And let's start with the most common method, which is get. And this method is used to retrieve data from the server. And as a side note, the get method is the default method used by web browsers. Therefore, if I navigate to localhost 5000 API tasks, if I navigate to this URL, I can nicely see my data because by default, browsers perform a GET request. So that's how we can search the web. So if we navigate to a network tab, if I refresh, notice I have here tasks, and we can inspect this request. And for some reason, I clicked away. So now let me make this bigger. Notice in here, we can find a bunch of useful information about the request as well as the response. And we can start over here, request URL. So this is the URL. Then notice the method, get method. So effectively, we are getting data from the server. And essentially, this is what we're doing when we're searching the web. So we open up the browser, and the browser sends a GET request to the specific server. For example, you can type YouTube, right? So then it sends a GET request to the YouTube server. And the YouTube server checks the request, checks the method, and goes like, okay, the browser is requesting this, so let me send this back. Now, of course, it depends on the resource. It can be a HTML page. It can be over here some data and all kinds of things. But again, the general idea doesn't change. We have the URL and we also have a method. And get method retrieves data from the server. And this brings us to the point we already discussed before. When it comes to a request, it consists of URL as well as the method. So you can have the same URL, but different method. And based on that combination, server is going to do something, whether that is to return all of the data, which is in the case of get, or in the case of post, for example, we are creating a resource on a server. And as far as our front end, if we use Axios, we go with Axios dot and get. Now, of course, we already have the custom instance, so we'll use our custom instance, but the idea doesn't change. And of course, also keep in mind that by default, Axios performs a GET request, so technically we can remove it, but I just always like the clarity. So even though it's a default one, I still type the GET one. And then, of course, in here, we just provide the URL. Now, of course, if you don't have the base URL, you would provide the full URL, but if you have it, then you just add the specific endpoint. So let's keep on moving. And up next, we have the post method. So this one is used to send data to the server in order to create a resource. Now, when it comes to the front end, we go with Axios and post. And again, these URLs, the API data can be the same. But notice the methods. So in one case, we have the get, and in the other one, we have the post. So in the first case, we are getting the data from the server. And when it comes to post, we are creating that resource on a server. And here's the deal. Since we're creating a resource on a server, we also need to provide that resource. You see, that's the difference between getting a resource from the server and creating a resource on the server. Because when we create resource, we also need to send it in our request. And therefore, the second argument we pass into a post is the actual data. Now, in this case, it's an object with two properties, but it can be pretty much anything. And then in the response, we can see what server sends back. Now, there is no rule what server needs to send back, and you'll see more of this once we actually set up our post request. Then you'll see what we're getting back actually from this particular server. Again, the main difference, if we want to get data with Axios on the front end, we go with axios.get. But if we want to post data, if we want to create the resource, then we go with axios.post. We provide the URL and we also provide the data. And of course, this one also returns a promise. That's why we go with await. And pretty much all of them do, so I'm not going to mention that anymore. Then, similar to post, we also have the patch one. So this one is when we want to update something. And the reason why I'm not showing you these ones in the browser, because, well, we cannot do it in the browser. Browser just performs a GET request. That's it. So these ones we'll have to do in our code. And the idea is very similar. Again, we go with axios.patch. So this will have a method of patch in the request, something we'll take a look at a little bit later. Then we need to go with URL, and typically it's looking for some kind of unique identifier. So ID is quite common. Why? Well, because how else are you going to know what do you want to update? You don't want to update some random item. You want to update the specific item. So you go with the URL, and then at the end, usually there's some unique identifier. And again, since I want to update something, I need to provide that value. That's why the second argument is, again, the data I want to send to the server. And if everything is correct, then it gets updated. And when it comes to delete, essentially same deal. We go with axios.delete. So now the request is going out with the method of delete. And we go with URL. And again, some unique identifier because you don't want to delete some random resource. And all of these actions combined are quite commonly referred to as CRUD, which stands for create, read, update, and delete. And these are going to be your main building blocks. If you know how to do those four things on a server, you'll be solid. The rest of the functionality, you'll just build on top of it. And once you're familiar with the most common HTTP methods, your next question probably goes something like this. Okay, so there are various methods and each of them performs something different. So how am I supposed to know what is the URL and what is the method that I need to use? Well, this is where the API documentation comes into play. So for this project, I prepared a documentation, and if you want to navigate there, just click on the link. You'll hit this URL and then notice. So these are all the actions we can perform on the server. And one by one, we can explore what is the URL, what are we getting back, and what data do we need to provide. And essentially, this is going to be your best friend. So each and every time you want to start working on some kind of project, you will need a documentation. Please keep in mind, you cannot just magically come up with your own URLs and with your own methods. You can only perform actions that are available on the server. And if it's a good documentation, essentially it describes everything to the last detail. So what is the URL? What is the method that you need to use? And quite typically, again, you have these helpers where you can clearly see the examples. And as a result, it's much easier to set up your own application. Now, of course, you might encounter some bad documentation. It also happens. There's no rule that says that you only can create documentation in one way. And of course, if that's the case, it's much harder to create the front-end application. Now, there are two main flavors. You can have the internal documentation, essentially a documentation that is used within the company, or you can have a public one. So there's a public API. It's available to everyone. Maybe you need to sign up, Maybe you need to pay some money. I mean, that all depends, but the general idea is the same. You have some kind of resource where you can find out what are the actions you can perform on that server. Hopefully that is clear. So now let's go down the list. First one is get all tasks. What is the URL? Localhost 5000 API and then tasks. What is the method that we need to use? That is get. So here, notice this is the request, this is the host, and then this is what we're going to get back. And essentially, it matches exactly what we have over here because, like I just mentioned, by default, browsers perform a GET request. Now, if you're not happy with this type of syntax, you can change it over here. Notice where you have the language, and you can maybe go for fetch one. However, in my opinion, is just way too much stuff. So notice over here, they create the request options object. They provide all of this data, and then they set up the request. So since I prefer clarity, I'm going to stick with HTTP one. But if you don't like the syntax, then again, you can pick any of these options. So again, we have get request, the URL, the method, and this is what we're getting back. Now, as far as creating a task, well, the URL is the same. So API tasks, and keep in mind that's already our base URL. So we're good to go. We just add the / and we're off to the races. Now the method needs to be a post one. And notice we do need to provide the title. So when we're creating a new task, the only thing server is looking for is the title. Now, if we don't provide the title, you'll see that we'll get back an error. So the response with the status code of 400. But if the title is provided, then we'll get back this object. We'll get back task ID. So the server will generate that task ID for us. Then we'll have the same name. So title, and then is done is going to be by default false. So this one will be false by default. And then once we change it on the front end, that's when we'll update, of course, the data on the server. And that's when we will see the latest values. So that is as far as post. Now, when it comes to patch, check it out. So this is the URL. And of course, this will be dynamic. Since we can fetch all of the tasks, correct? On our front end, we'll store this data. And then we'll use this ID to construct the URL. So when we go with API tasks, we'll provide the ID. And we'll say, okay, is done is true. Now, of course, we can set it back to false as well. Hopefully that is clear. And then when it comes to response, in this case, server is going to send a message. So there's going to be an object with a message property, task updated. So we will have to figure out how to display those latest changes. Essentially, this is going to be up to us. And then same deal for deleting the task. We have the ID, we provide, we go with API tasks. Now the method is delete. And if we're successful, we'll get back the message task removed. Again, the API documentation is going to be your best friend since we can only perform actions that are available on a server. And if it's a good API documentation, then everything is clearly described. What is the URL and what is the method, as well as what data we need to provide. And it's pretty much impossible to build any kind of application without the documentation. Unless, of course, you built a server yourself. And of course, then you know exactly what are the routes as well as the methods. All right, now that we're familiar with the general theory, let's get to work and start communicating with the server. And we're going to start with something we already know, which is fetching data from the server. Basically, I want to get a list of tasks and display them in my app. And after that, we will implement the rest of the logic. Our first approach might be following: navigate to app, JSX, import, use effect, and set up such code. Now, technically, there's nothing wrong with this approach. Well, at least initially. You see, when working with server data, the biggest challenge is to keep your React app data, effectively your React app state, in sync with the server data. And the bigger the app, the harder it's going to be. So even though technically, especially in this application, we can set up everything with just Axios and few use effects, it's going to be much easier if we use a library by the name of React Query. Now, you can read more about React Query in the README or just navigate to the docs. Notice I left the link also in the README. But in short, React Query is a popular state management library in React community because it simplifies the management of state and data. So effectively, the problem that I just mentioned, keeping our app state in sync with server, React Query just makes it a breeze. On top of it, it provides effective caching, automatic background refetching, and error handling. Its functionality and ability to address common challenges in application development has made it a go-to option for many developers. A few more things I want to mention in this video. As far as versions in this project, we're going to use version 4 of React Query since it's the latest version as I'm recording this project. But since React Query releases new versions, I would say quite often, keep in mind that by the time you're watching this, there might be a new version out there. At that point, you have a few options. You can either install and stick with the version 4, or use the very latest version and reference the docs. Also, if you check the docs, you'll see that there's a lot of info. I mean, a lot. Since React Query offers tons of features. And we'll use this app to learn the main features. So you can get up and running with React Query. And after that, if you're looking for a specific feature, I encourage you to explore the docs. Okay, and up next, let's install and set up the React Query. Now, if you take a look at the package.json, you'll see that I already installed React Query, so it's already present in this project. And we're using version 4.28, so that's the version. Now, if you want to install React Query in your own project, just go with this command, npm i@danstack and /React Query. And once you're done with install, you want to wrap your entire application in Query Client Provider, as well as set up a query client. So we want to navigate to main JSX, and we want to import the Query Client Provider, as well as the query client. Let me try the auto import. So I'm going to navigate to main JSX. I want to wrap the entire application, and therefore in here, I'm going to go with query, and notice that's my provider. Yep, the auto import works. Let me wrap my app in the Query Client Provider. And we also want to grab the query client. Let's add a comma. And first we need to create a new instance. So in this case, I'm going to go with const, and I'm going to call this the same. So query client is equal to new query client. So we create this new instance, and then we want to set it here in the Query Client Provider. And effectively, as a result, all throughout our application, we'll have access to that new instance. So in here, the prop name is client. So this is a special prop, and we provide over here a query client. And with this in place, we can start setting up our requests with React Query. All right, and once we have installed and completed the setup for React Query, now let's set up our first request with React Query library. So in my case, I'm going to work in items JSX simply because I want to showcase that when we're working with React Query, since essentially it is a state management library, we don't always have to use context, which is really, really awesome. So effectively, right out of the box, we can set up our queries in multiple components, and we don't need to always pass them down. Again, there's going to be some instances where you maybe want to store some results in context. I'm not saying that the moment you start using React Query, you'll never use context API, but oftentimes since React Query is already a state management library, you can nicely set up your functionality all throughout your application. So you don't need to always set up everything in app.jsx and pass it down. And React Query provides some nice ways how we can communicate between those queries. And if this sounds somewhat iffy right now, trust me, you'll see what I'm talking about once we make the post request. So back to the README, our first query, we want to import use query hook from React Query. So notice no use effects. We're just grabbing a use query hook from the React Query. Then we'll get back the result, which for now we'll just log because I want all of us to be on the same page. And as far as the argument, use query is looking for the object with these two properties. So query key and query function. Now, when it comes to a query key, it's a unique key we provide, and later it's used internally for fetching, caching, and sharing the queries throughout the application. Now, technically, you can set it up as a straight up string. However, I'll be setting this up as an array, and you'll see the use cases in the later projects. I don't think we will do anything in this project, but in later projects, you'll see why we want to set up the array. And when it comes to a query function, it can be literally any function that returns a promise. And remember, when it comes to Axios, by default, it right away returns a promise. Now, there are multiple flavors how we can set up this function. And yes, we'll cover some of those options in the following videos. For now, just so we can type less, let's simply set up a function and pass custom fetch.get. Remember, the base URL right away goes to our localhost 5000 API tasks. And by default, this returns a promise. And then we'll see what we have in the result and what are our options. So now let's navigate to items. Again, I'm purposely setting up over here just so you can right away see that we don't need to set up everything in the context or in the app. Basically, in our top level component. Use query is super awesome, where we can easily communicate between components. And first, we want to start by grabbing that use query. So again, I'll try to stick to auto import. Yep, use query. So we import this. We're not going to worry about what we want to pass in. For now, let's just go with the result. That is equal to a use query. And let's also right away log the result. And then remember, we want to pass in the object with two keys. We want to go with query key, which essentially is going to be unique to this particular query. And we need to come up with a name. So any kind of string is fine. If you want to go with banana, totally valid option. I'm going to go with tasks and then comma. And then we want to go with query and function. So like I said, this function at the end of the day needs to return a promise. So let's set up our function and we're just going to go with custom fetch. Remember, by default it's get, but I'll still add it over here. And then since my base URL is already pointing to my server, more specifically API tasks, I simply want to add the /. That's it. That's all I need to do. So now let's save it. And now let's see what we have as far as the result. So I'm going to navigate to the big browser just because I want to see everything better. Let's inspect. And we should see this object over here. Notice it has tons and tons and tons of data. And our actual data is located over here. So if we're successful, notice in here we have the object and we'll have somewhat nested structure just because this is how the Axios returns the data. So notice if you open data object in here, I have data property. Again, this is an Axios thing. This is not React Query. React Query just stores it here in data. and then Axios also stores it in a data. So we have this data, and then we have a task list. Now, why do we have a task list? Because this is what I'm returning from the server. If I'm going to change it to shake and bake, then of course in here, I'll also see the shake and bake. So effectively, we're looking for this array. That's what we eventually want to display. Now we can also see the error property. So if there's an error, there's going to be some value. At the moment, it's null. We have is error. So this one is a Boolean, which essentially checks for it. And then we can provide, for example, our error message. In here, we can see the actual error message, which in this case, again, is going to be coming from Axios, since we're using Axios. If, for example, you're using fetch, then of course the error is going to be different. We have is loading. Again, at the moment it's false because we already got the data. And I'm not going to refresh right now because of course it's going to be very hard to showcase the is loading. And we have a bunch of other properties. But essentially, you can already imagine that these three we're going to use the most. So data, this is where our actual data is going to be located. In order to check for error, we can go with is error. If we want to have a specific error, we'll look for error property. And then we also have is loading, which is going to be super useful while we're loading data. All right. And once we have our first query in place and we are familiar what we get back in the result, now let's set up is loading and let's see our options as far as the data. Now, we have few approaches. If you want, you can go with result dot. So for example, if I want to check for loading, I'm going to go with if result is loading, if it's true, and then what do I want to do? Or of course, we can right away destructure everything where I have the result. So again, this is totally up to you. And in my case, I'm going to destructure. But if you don't like that type of approach, then of course, just change it around and set it up with result dot. So first, I want to grab is loading. So now, of course, I have no results. So I'll remove this console log. And I also want to grab the data. Now, as far as loading, it's going to be somewhat straightforward where I just want to return a paragraph with the text of loading. So let's go here. Let's say if is loading. So initially, of course, it's going to be true. Then we want to go with a return. Let's return a paragraph. Now, I don't want to add any styles and I didn't want to set up the class. So I'll just add inline style. I'll say margin and we're looking for top. And let's just set it equal to 1 REMs. And then when it comes to actual text, I'm going to go with loading and then dot. So now let's navigate back. Let's refresh. And for a split second, we'll see that loading. Now, of course, in order to properly see it, we need to go again to a network tab. And as a side note, this pretty much is going to be your best friend since you'll be able to find out a bunch of useful info in here. And in my case, I think I'm going to go with fast 3G. I just want to showcase that pretty much the general idea doesn't change. We'll still use all of the functionality we already did with UseEffect. The difference right now is that everything is already provided by the React query library. So while we're loading, we'll still display the paragraph with text of loading, and then eventually we'll get back the data. Now, if you remember the previous video, essentially, we know that we have quite a nested structure simply because we are using React query and the Axios, and both of them use that data property. So in order to access that task list, I need to go with data.data, and then the actual array is in the task list. So let's navigate back, and right after the loading, instead of items, instead of this hard-coded items that are coming from app.jsx, I'm going to remove the prop. So you can clearly see that I'm not accessing that data. And we're going to go with data.data and then task list and then map. And if everything is correct, we should see the exact same result in the browser. And I think at this point I can go back to normal speed and notice nothing changed. Why? Well, because this is the array that I have on a server. So of course, if I'm going to go back to the server and change something about this array, then of course the same results we'll see in the browser. Now, I don't suggest doing that simply because I want to keep the server intact. You'll see the changes in real time once we start updating the data. And also in the network tab, you can nicely see here a request to the tasks. And notice this is the URL over here, and this is the method. And we can also take a look at the response. Notice this is what we're getting back, and bunch of useful info about the request as well as the response. Now, in our case, we're mainly focused on these two things. So the URL we're using as well as the method, and also a status code 200, which simply means that we were successful. Now, if you don't like this approach with data task list, we can also change this function over here. We can turn it into a sync. Then we can set up the curlies over here, and then we can stick a wait in front of it. So I can go with const, and I can pull out the data. Remember, it returns an object, and we're just looking for that data property. So I'm going to go here with data. Now that is equal to my await. I want to stick await in front of the custom fetch, and then from this function, I want to return that data. So effectively, I'm skipping that one step. So instead of data, I right away grab the data and then the task list. And of course, this is totally up to you. Some people prefer the previous approach and some use this one. So just decide whichever option you are more comfortable with. And while we're still working on get all tasks functionality, I also want to talk about error handling. And essentially, we have few approaches. We can use isError, which is more of a generic, I would say, approach, where we can get this Boolean. If it's true, then we return our error message, or we can actually get the error message, which is received by React Query. Now, since we are using Axios, it will be actually a Axios error. So effectively, remember, we are returning a promise over here. So if it's fulfilled, then of course we are returning this data. If not, then again, Axios throws an error. So we can access the actual message in this error property. So I guess let's just try it out with isError. So we'll set up our generic one, and then we'll also cover the error one. So first I want to navigate to items. And once I'm here, I just want to mess with this URL. Again, remember, since we have the custom fetch in place, we have this base URL. However, if I add something to the URL over here, so let's say instead of /, I'm going to go with something. That means I'm requesting a resource which is not going to be on a server. Now, how do I know that? Well, because I created the server. And you also cannot find such URL in the docs, which is a good indication that most likely it's not going to exist on a server. So in this case, we'll still have loading. Yeah, that's true, but we're not going to get back data. So we'll have the error. And like I said, we have few approaches. We can go with isError, and also we can get the actual error. So let me save it, and I guess I'm going to start with isError. So let's try over here. Now I do want to move it after loading. My bad. So in between the loading and data, just like we were doing before. So we're going to go here with isError. And you know what? In order to speed this up, I'll just copy and paste. We'll still keep the margin and all that. I'll just say there was an error. So this is going to be our generic message. So now let's navigate to the browser. And first of all, you'll see how React Query essentially is trying few times. And essentially after a few times of trying, then it throws that error. And notice over here, I have the text display. Now, if we want to get the actual error, let's do the same thing. Let's copy and paste first of all. I'll comment this one out so it stays for your reference. And effectively, I already know that it's in the message property, but just so we are on the same page, let me log the error. And you know what? I will cheat a little bit. I'll right away access it. Say error and message. Again, please keep in mind that this is going to be Axios error. So of course, if you're using fetch, most likely that error won't be in the same message property. So let's try it out. Again, I'm going to navigate to the browser. Let me refresh. Again, React Query is going to try to find the resource a few times. And after multiple requests, notice over here, now I'm displaying this message. Now, how do I know that it's in there? Well, if I log the error that I get back from React Query, notice, like I keep saying, I know it's probably annoying, but this is an Axios error. So we get back the Axios error, and the actual error message is over here. It's in this property. So of course, the only thing we're doing is basically displaying the message. Now, you can also go a little bit different route where you can go with response and then data. So this effectively will be a response that I'm sending back from the server. And you can actually check that if you navigate to the server. Again, please don't change any code over here. But if you'll navigate over here, all the way in the bottom, you'll notice this response.status 404. So this will be the error message that we're sending back from the server. And notice how server is displaying that there's a GET request. It's going to this route, but we're sending back 404. So let's go back one more time. And instead of that error message, why don't we go with error response? And then I believe it was data. Yep. Let me try over here. So data. Yep. That should do it. So let's try one more time. Let me save it here. Let's navigate to a browser. Let me refresh. And now I should see the message that is coming from the server. And we can see all of those things over here in the network tab as well. And notice now I have route does not exist. So effectively, those are your options as far as the error handling. And as far as this project, I'm pretty sure that I'm just going to stick to that is error. So now let me navigate to my project. And like I said, I'll keep this one for your reference, I guess. And let me just use is error. So with this in place, now we are ready to proceed to the next step. All right. Before we start creating tasks on the server, let me show you an extremely useful extension, which will allow us to right away test our API endpoints without even writing a single line of code. So we want to navigate to the extensions. I'll make this one right now bigger. And we're searching for Thunder Client. Hopefully the name is correct. Yep, Thunder Client. We want to install. Now it might request to restart. Yep, we're all good. And then we're looking for this icon over here. So once we install, in order to access, we just need to click on this icon. And I'll cover some of the features as we're working on a project. But the first thing we want to do is set up a new request. So essentially, without writing code, we'll be able to test whether the endpoint is correct. Basically, whether we provide the correct method, the URL, and all that stuff. Like I said, I'll cover these options a little bit later. First, we want to click on New Request. So notice in here, I can provide a method. So whether it's going to be post, put, delete, and all that. And in here, we want to provide the URL. And of course, for different requests, we might need to add the auth, the body, and all that. And let's just start by getting those tasks, something we already did. So we know that the method is get, correct? And then we want to get the URL. Now we have multiple options. First of all, you can type it if you want, but that is not usually my preference. And I think the best way is going to be if we navigate to the docs and just right away copy that. Again, Doesn't really matter as far as the get and post. Both of them go to the same URL, but I'll use this one just to stay consistent. So let me navigate back over here, copy and paste, and check it out. Once I click on send, what do I see over here? So this is going to be my response. Now, why is this so useful? Well, because we can check our endpoint without writing a single line of code. So now I know that, yes, for sure, the method is get. Yes, for sure, this is the URL. And yes, for sure, this is the response that I'm going to get back on my front end. So now I have a very good idea what the server is expecting. So as I'm writing my front end code, if for some weird reason I get a bug, I have a good idea that most likely, you know what, it's probably because of how I was setting up the code. Trust me, it's nothing more frustrating than, let's say, spending half an hour on debugging your code just to realize that, you know what, the URL was a little bit off. You know what, you didn't use the correct method, or you didn't pass the right data to the server. So when you start working with the server data, this is going to be an awesome tool, which will, for one, speed up your development. And second, it will help you to avoid a lot of frustration, because we're not dealing anymore with just our application. Now we also need to keep the server happy. We need to make requests that the server is expecting. Otherwise, we'll just get back errors. And therefore, throughout this application, yes, we will implement it, because I want you to get comfortable with this awesome tool. So at this point, we're familiar with React Query. We're familiar with Thunder Client extension, and we can successfully pull all of the tasks into our application. But the real challenge starts when we need to start creating resources on the server, or updating the resources, or deleting them, because now we will have to keep everything in sync. And I want to start with a small challenge. So first, I want you to go to the docs, decide which route and method you need to use in order to create a task on the server, what data you need to provide, and test it in the Thunder client. And just to give you a little hint, in the Thunder client, you're looking for the body when you're setting up the request. So remember, this is going to be our interface, and you're looking for this one in order to test it. And at least when I work with servers, this is very typical start for me. Before I start typing any code, I want to make sure that I have all the info that server is looking for. Like I just said previously, there's nothing more frustrating than trying to debug the code and eventually just to find out that, you know what, the code wasn't the issue. It was the URL or the method. So if you're interested, stop the video, try to work on a challenge, and resume once you're ready to compare the results. So first, let me navigate to a browser. Notice over here, so I'm located in the documentation. Let's keep on scrolling. We can successfully get all of the tasks. And up next, we want to create the task. Right away, I can see that this is going to be a post method. So we will create a resource on the server, and effectively the route is the same. Like I said, routes can be the same. If the method is different, as far as server is concerned, those are two different functionalities. I know that this is probably a little bit confusing in the beginning, but yes, that's the case. So we have the same URL, we just have a different method. And now since we're creating a resource on the server, we also need to pass in data. Otherwise, well, how I can create anything if I'm not providing that data? And in this case, we want to send a object. In there, there's going to be a title property and some kind of string value. Now, of course, as far as the string value, you can provide anything you want, but this must be a title with a lowercase. So don't go with titles, don't go with title uppercase. you will get back an error. Server is going to be like, hey, listen, whatever you provided doesn't match what I'm looking for. So unfortunately, there's nothing I can do. So title with a lowercase and then provide some kind of string value. So now that we know all of this info, I'm going to navigate back to my Thunder client. And before we set up the request, let me show you some awesome features. And first, we can set up collections. And effectively, you can think of it this way. We just want to group our requests. Of course, this is not going to be the only application we ever work on. So it would be useful if we could just group all of the requests for this application. And then when it comes to the next one, again, we'll repeat. We'll create the collection and all of that shebang. So let's start over here. We'll go with new collection. I'll call it tasks app over here. So notice at the moment there's nothing in there, but we can nicely create a new request. And we just need to come up with a name. In my case, I'm going to go with create task. Okay, beautiful. Now, this is not going to be a GET request. That's the first thing we need to change. So go with post. Then remember, we do need to provide that URL. And technically, you can run back to the activity one. So click on the activity tab, and then you can get this one over here, and you can copy and paste. Or we can set up a nice env variable. Now, again, why is that useful? Well, because similar to our utils one, essentially, I can just reuse it. I don't have to type it each and every time, because remember, on a server, all of those requests start with this API tasks, all of them. So we can just save a little bit of time. So now let's navigate to over here. We're looking for env, and we want to create a new one. Now, I'm going to go right away with the global one. Of course, you can set up the local one and all that. So in here, we just want to come up with a name. In my case, I will go with the generic one. I'll say URL, and then we want to provide the value. So this is the case where, again, I'll copy and paste. Let's set it up over here, and then we save. Now, in order to access, we'll go with double curlies. So let me show you what I'm talking about. I'm going to navigate to create task. And essentially, let's just go with double curlies, URL, and then again, double curlies. And in here, we're looking for the body. So again, we need to provide that data. So let's open this one up. We want to choose the JSON one. Then we want to set up over here the curly braces. And remember, we need to go with title property. So that's a must. And then we need to provide some kind of value. So I'll say over here, some value. I send it and check it out. If everything is correct, this is what we should see in the response. So we get back an object. In there, I have a task object. And more specifically, I have ID, title, and is done. And what's really cool, that actually in our own application, we'll right away see that. Hopefully, if I fix the bug. Or you know what? I actually didn't, so my bad. Let me go to items, and of course, I'm not looking for something. Let me remove. My bad. Let's go over here, and we should see the latest one as well, because now it's actually on a server. So you see how cool it is. We create something on a server, and now pretty much all of the applications that use it right away have access to it. And of course, the more tasks I'm going to create this way, well, the more I'll have when I'm fetching all of them back from the server. And again, I clearly know that everything works. So it's a post method, the same URL, and then I need to provide this title. So now my job is following. I want to go back to my application and set up following logic. Once the user provides the input and clicks on add task, basically submits the form, I send a post request to the server, and I create a new task on the server. And one last thing that I want to show you in this video. So if we want to add this request to our collection, again, just look for activity, click on these three dots, then click on save to collection. we need to come up with the name. So in my case, I'm going to go with get all tasks. And then we're looking for that specific collection. So in our case, tasks app. Submit. And now if we go back to our collections, notice under the tasks app, I have two. I have one to create the task and also one to get all tasks. All right. And once we have successfully tested the create task endpoint, now let's set up the functionality in our application. And before we start typing away, I just want to mention that eventually, at the very end of the project, we will refactor this even more. So we'll create a file where we're going to set up few custom hooks, and we'll just import some functionality from that file. So if you're bothered by the amount of code we have in the items component, don't worry. Eventually, there's going to be less. So now let's start working on that create task functionality. And where do we want to set it up? Well, in the form, correct? So this is where we are getting that new item. So as the user is typing, we're updating the state value. And we also have handle submit. So eventually, once we submit the form, we will communicate with a server. Now, when it comes to creating, editing, basically updating the resource or deleting, we want to use mutation hook. So when we want to fetch, that's when we go with use query. So that is a hook that's coming from React Query. When we want to create, edit, and delete, that's when we go with use mutation. Same deal, it's a hook, so all the hooks rules apply. We want to essentially invoke it inside of the hook or inside of the component. So we're going to go here with use mutation. Again, we'll have to pass in the object. I will work on that in a second. And again, I want to log the entire result so you see where all of the data is coming from. So let me just go with const result, use mutation. And this is the case where we can skip the key part. And I can go right away with mutation and function. Now, as far as this function, eventually we'll set up the parameter, but I just want to showcase again how everything works. So for now, I'm just going to go with function. And again, the same deal. We either want to return a promise or we want to throw an error. And then remember, Axios returns a promise. So in this case, I'm going to go with implicit return, and I'm just going to type custom fetch since we already have the URL. This either returns a promise or throws an error. And now remember, we're looking for post method. So you want to create data on a server. And as far as the URL, like I said, /, that's the whole point why we're using custom fetch, since the URL already points to the correct endpoint. And as far as the second argument, we want to go with an object. And remember the property name title, correct? So we're going to go here with title. And for now, since we're not providing any values over here, I'm just going to go with some title. Let's save. And again, for now, let's just log what we get back in the result. So now let me save, navigate to the browser and refresh just so we can start from the clean slate. And if I take a look at the log, notice I'll have a bunch of useful info again. So I'll have data, error, is loading, and also a mutate. So what is this mutate? Well, that's the function that we set equal to a mutation function. So in this result, there's a property which actually is referencing this function. So in order to communicate with the server, we need to invoke this function. Now, when do we want to do that? Well, I guess when the user is submitting the form, correct? Again, same deal. You can either go with result and then mutate, or you can destructure. And also what's really cool, we can right away give this an alias. And it's going to become especially important when you have multiple functionalities in the same file. Let's say in our case, it's going to be with editing and deleting in the single item, because JavaScript rules apply. We cannot have like 10 mutate variables in our application. We can have only one, basically, in that one particular file. And therefore, it's very useful if we can right away give it an alias, and it's also a little bit easier to read. So what I'm trying to say, I'm going to destructure out the mutate, but I'll right away give it an alias. I'll say create task. Now, again, you don't have to do it, but I will. And also, I'm going to grab is loading. So while the request is taking place, I want to disable the submit button. So I want to wait for response. And only when I get the response, then the user can, I don't know, create another task. So let's go with comma here. And we're going to go with is loading. And let's start with that one. It's going to be easier. So we just want to navigate to a submit button. There is an attribute by the name of disabled. And I simply want to set it equal to my is loading. So while the request is going to be taking place, this is going to be true. And then once we're good to go, basically either we get the error or we are successful, then of course this will be false. So then the button won't be disabled. And now let's navigate over here where we have handle submit. And again, we're still hard coding, don't worry. We'll fix that in a second. And let's just go with create task. Let's just invoke it so we can see how everything works. So let me navigate over here. Let me type some kind of random value. Please keep in mind, we right away won't see the values. We will have to refresh, and we'll cover this in bigger detail in the upcoming video. So for now, let's just go with, I don't know, random task. Let's submit. Again, we want to refresh, and notice over here, now I have the sum title. So even though I provided some value, since we're hard coding over here, that's the task we're creating on the server. So what do we want to do over here? Well, we want to provide the parameter, use it inside of our request. And of course, when we invoke our mutate or create task, I just want to grab this one, correct? And I'm purposely not checking for empty values because there is a check on the server. And I want to show you what happens when we get the error and how we can handle such error on the front end. So therefore, again, I'm not checking for empty values. This is actually going to be one functionality we want to set up a little bit later, where if the user provides the empty values, we get back response from the server, and then we display, hey, you did not provide all of the values. So let's go to a create task. We want to go with new item name, and then here we just need to come up with the parameter. So in my case, I'm going to go with task and title. So now instead of hard coding this title, I'll set it equal to a task title. So now let's save. Let's navigate back. Again, we won't see right away the tasks. That's something that we need to work on in the upcoming video. For now, we'll have to refresh. Don't worry, that's not going to be the case in the final application. So again, let me go with the random one since I'm too lazy to come up with new values. And let's add a task. Let's refresh. And now everything is correct. So now I see this random title. And as a side note, again, we can go over here to a network. And let me type some second task or something along those lines. We can actually filter this to a fetch request, add task over here. And once we add the task, we can inspect our request. So notice, this is going to be our URL. So we're sending this to a tasks one. The method is post, and we get back 200. So everything went smoothly. Now, if I'll try to submit an empty task, notice now I get 400, which means bad request. Of course, the request method was still post and URL. Now the response was different that we got back from the server. So this is going to be our initial setup when we want to create a task. All right. So we can successfully send a post request to the server. If we don't provide the values, we get back the error. If everything is correct, we create a new task, and we definitely know that. The only problem is that we need to refresh the browser. And probably you will agree with me, that is not the best user experience. Imagine if you have an application and then every time you do something with an app, in order to see the changes, you need to refresh the browser. Now, how we can fix that? Well, use mutation comes with awesome helper functions. One is on success, and the second one is on error. And you can probably already guess what each of them is doing. And actually, let's start with error, because I believe it's going to be a bit more straightforward. Effectively, it's just less lines of code. So let's navigate to our form. We're looking for our use mutation, and then right after that, let's set up those two things. On success, which for now is just going to be an empty function. And the second one is going to be the error one. So let's copy and paste. And I just want to change the name. And what's really cool, effectively this fires if there is an error. And what's even better, we can access the actual error. Now, in a second, we'll use our toast to display it, but I just want to showcase where we can get all of the values. And therefore, I'll go with console log and error. Let me save it. Let me navigate to the browser. And again, we want to provide an empty value because the server is doing that error checking. And just to answer your question, yes, normally you have checks in two places. You have checks on the front end as well as the back end. In this case, since we're just starting to work with the server, we'll just stick with the server checks. But normally, yes, in both places we check for these types of errors. So again, let me just clean out everything as far as the network tab is concerned. Let me refresh over here and let me provide a empty one. So check it out. Again, I have this error. I can clearly see that. So this one is 400, which stands for bad request error. And then if I take a look at the console, it's our best friend, the Axios error. And notice over here, I have the response. In the response, I have the data, and this is my message. Again, this is what we're getting back from the server. And now our goal is to display this error to the user. And we have multiple options, but in my opinion, the fastest one and also the best looking one is to use our React Toastify library, something we already covered in the previous project. So in the form, I want to import the toast function from Toastify. And once I get the error, I simply want to pass that message. So let's go to error. Let's set up a toast. Hopefully auto import works. We want to go with error over here and let's pass in the error. So Axios error, then response property. Then we want to go with data and then the message. And again, we can test it out nicely in the browser. Let's just refresh. Let's try to add an empty one and notice over here. It says right away, please provide the title. So that's the error setup. Now, what do we want to do with on success? Well, that's an awesome question. You see, we know that we're adding the task on the server, correct? We can clearly see that. And as you can see, I was just messing around with this application, so I have a bunch of second task items. But how can we get those latest values without refreshing the browser? And this is, again, that hard part, especially if you're using that use effect, because you manually need to refetch essentially those latest tasks. Now, what's really cool about React Query, it has a method for that, which invalidates the query. Now, which query do we want to invalidate? Well, the tasks one. And as a result, React Query will refetch those tasks for us. And trust me, it's not that easy to do if you're working with a use effect. So let's try this one out. I'm going to navigate back again. We're still working in the form. However, in this case, we want to grab that client. Remember, all the way back when we were setting up the React Query, we passed here this client. And we set it equal to our query client. So now we want to have access to it in the form. And what's really cool, that React Query provides a hook. And the hook name is use and query client. So this is when we want to import. Then we want to create that query client instance. So query, and I'm going to call this client, and that is equal to use query client. So now we have access to it. And now in the on success, I want to do three things. First, I want to invalidate the tasks query. And this is why it was important when we were setting up get all tasks query to provide this query key, because now we'll use it in order to invalidate it. That's the first thing that I want to do. Second, I'll use the toast. I'll say, hey, task added to the list or something along those lines. And then lastly, I probably want to set this equal to an empty string, correct? So user can start from the scratch. So let's navigate to onSuccess. Now this onSuccess also has a bunch of useful parameters, but since in this case, we're not going to use it, I don't think there's a need to overcomplicate things. So we want to go with query client. Then there's a special method invalidate queries. And what do we want to pass over here? Well, we want to go with query key, and we want to provide, well, which query we want to invalidate. So since the name was tasks, yes, they do need to match. So make sure that the name is exact. Otherwise, it's not going to work. So that's the first thing. What do we want to do after that? Well, toast, and we're going to go with success. And let's just go with task added. And then lastly, let's go with set new item name. And now we want to go with an empty string. So those are three things that I want to do if I'm successful. If there's an error, we already know what we're doing. Effectively, we are displaying that toast. So let me refresh. I have a bunch of tasks over here, and let's try it out. First, let's just try with the error. Okay, everything still works, which is just awesome. And now let's try to add the task. Let's see whether I have, yep, I already have the random one. So let me go with second random and task. Let's create one. Notice I nicely see task added to the list. And also all the way in the bottom, I have second random task. And notice in the request, it's also the same deal. So I have successful post request to this URL over here. And then after the successful post request, we refetch all of the tasks back from the server. And again, I know I already have said this probably 30,000 times, but this is the toughest part because you always want to keep both in sync, your application state as well as the server state. Because it's very easy to start coding away and then realize, hey, actually data on a server doesn't match what I have on a front end. And React Query makes it very easy. Effectively, with 2 lines of code, we're up to date. And trust me when I say this, if you just use UseEffect, it's much harder to do. All right, and once we can successfully create a task, now let's set up edit task functionality. And since most of the logic is the same, literally there's only a few things that are going to be different, I right away want to set this one up as a challenge. So try to accomplish on your own. And then once you're ready to compare the results, resume with the video. And basically, I want you to go to the docs, check the URL, check the method, check what data we need to provide, because similarly to create task, we'll also need to provide some info. Then test everything in Thunder client. And after that, set up the functionality. And few hints, you want to do that in item JSX. You want to look for edit log. So this is where you'll invoke the mutation function. And also in this case, we'll need to pass in 2 arguments in the mutation function. Why? Well, because we also need an ID. Not only the data, which we used in create task, but also the ID. So in my case, I'm going to navigate back to the docs. So we're done with create task. That's already complete. And now also over here. So the method is batch. Then as far as the URL, we want to go with tasks, then / and then the ID. So of course, in our case, in the item, we're accessing the ID, the item JSX component. So we're iterating over, and remember, we just destructure it out of the props. So we use that ID in order to hit this endpoint. Again, this value will be dynamic depending on the task ID. Then we also want to change the is done, and therefore we go with is done and set it equal to true or false. Now, of course, we also have the title, but in this application, we won't change it. So in this case, we're just updating that is done. So this sucker over here. And then as far as the response, we're going to get back message and task updated. But it's not really our concern. Again, we'll have to invalidate that tasks query. Why? Well, because we want to get the latest tasks. So with this one, we'll nicely update data on a server. And if we're successful, then yes, we again want to refetch all of the queries. Hopefully that is clear. So now let's test it out in the Thunder client. I'll right away navigate to my tasks app and I'll create a new one over here. And I'm going to go with edit task. At least that's going to be my name. In here, let's grab the URL right away. Then /, and now let's go back to all of the tasks. Let's send it, and then we can use any of these tasks. And I'm going to pick the first one because why not? So /. Then as far as the body, remember, we're only updating that is done. So we do need to go with double quotation marks. We're going to go with is done. And of course, in here, we're hard coding. So I'm just going to check what is the current value. It is false. So now let's go with true. Let's send. And once I click on save, I have big fat error. Now, can you guess why that is the case? Well, remember, when it comes to server, it's looking for two things. It's looking for the route, so the URL, and as well as the method. So in this case, I just overlooked that this is actually get. So this should be patch. If we go with patch and then the URL, then everything is going to be correct. So now notice task updated, and I can nicely check that if I navigate to get all tasks. And once I run the request one more time, now is done is true. And once we have successfully tested the endpoint, we can navigate to single item and add edit item functionality. Okay, so now let's complete the edit functionality. First, we want to navigate to single item. So notice in the props, we have the item, and in there we have the properties, the is done, which we use in checkbox, and we set it equal to checked. And also we display the title. So first, let's set up the mutation. And in order to do that, of course, we do need to import it. So I'm going to go above my return, and I'm going to go with use mutation. Now, since we already covered it before, I'll right away access the mutate function, and I'll right away give it an alias. So we'll go here with mutate. That's what we're getting back. And I'm going to name this edit task. And in this component, you'll clearly see the benefits of using the aliases. So we set this equal to our use mutation. And up next, let's set up the function. So mutation function. And like I said, in this case, we'll need two things because we'll also need to provide the ID. And instead of passing them one by one, so let's say task ID and then comma and then is done, I'm going to combine both of them in one parameter. So I'll place them in the object. So now I know that I'm going to be getting the object, and I'll right away destructure the task ID and is done. Now, as far as the functionality, let me set up the curlies. We're going to go with return and then custom fetch. Now the method we're looking for is patch in this case, and now let's set up the URL. However, in this case, we want to go with the template strings. Why? Well, because we want to pass this task ID as our variable in here. So again, this is going to be changing based on the actual task ID. So let's set up template string, then /, and now let's access the task ID. So now every time we'll click on that edit one, we'll actually perform a request that matches the task ID. So this is going to be dynamic. Second, we still need to provide the data. So I'm going to go over here with is done. Remember, that was the property. And since the property name over here matches our variable, we can use the shorthand. And after that, we want to invoke it. So let's navigate to where we have the checkbox. At the moment, notice we have on change, and we're just logging edit task. And now we want to go with our mutation function. So edit task, and we want to provide two things. We want to provide the task ID and also whether it's done or not. And basically we'll set it equal to the opposite. Now remember, we have here the object. So first let's start with that task ID. What is it equal to? Well, we have the item over here, correct? So we can go with task ID equals to item dot and then the ID. So that's going to be my ID. Second, remember we want to pass is done, and also I have that is done on the item. And we use that value in our checkbox. So when I'm editing this item, effectively I want to set it equal to the opposite value. So I'm going to go with item dot and then is done. And we're almost done, but we also want to set up that on success. So we will nicely edit the item on a server, but again, we want to refetch all of the tasks so we can right away see the latest value that's on the server. And in order to do that, we need to set up the query client. So again, we're looking for the use query client. Let's invoke it. Let's set it equal to query client. And let's navigate to our use mutation hook. And let's add on and success. So if we're successful, what do we want to do? Well, we want to go with query client dot and then invalidate queries. Then let's pass in the object. We're looking for query key, and that will be equal to our array. And let's provide the tasks. Let's save it. And if everything is correct, we should see the latest values in the browser. And notice right away that while we were testing, I set the first task equal to true, right? So now, of course, this is the latest value. Again, I'm going to open up the network tab because, in my opinion, it's very useful essentially to see those requests. And now notice, once I click, I have two requests. I have one where we have this URL, and this is the method patch. And then right after that, again, we get the latest one. So now, of course, I can navigate around and I can essentially set all of them equal to complete. And then once I refresh, I still get those values. So I refetch the latest server data. And now let's complete our application and add the delete task functionality. And again, my suggestion is to try setting up everything on your own because pretty much all of the functionality is exactly the same. You just need to change some values around. And let's start by visiting the docs. So this is going to be our functionality, delete task. Again, we're looking for specific ID. So this will be our URL, and the method name is delete. Now we don't need to provide any values. So we simply want to go with method delete and then the ID. So which item we want to remove. And as far as response, this is what we'll get back. So message, task, remove, and we're good to go. Again, we're not going to use this value. Effectively, we're just looking for 200 response. If the response is 200, we are good to go. So let's test it out. First, let's navigate to a Thunder client. We're looking for our collections, and we want to add a new one. So let's go with new request, and I'm going to go with delete task. Then I'll right away set up the proper method, otherwise I'm going to forget. After that, we want to go again with our URL, double curlies, /. And now let me quickly take a look at all the tasks and which one I want to remove. You know what? Why don't we change it around? And I'm going to go with the last one. Let's navigate back over here, copy and paste. Again, we don't need to provide any value. We simply want to look for task removed. Now we can navigate to our single item and set up the functionality. And yes, this is the case where you can literally copy and paste because pretty much all of the functionality is the same. The difference, of course, that we're not looking for that is done. So we already have all of the imports. We simply want to set up another instance of use mutation. So let's copy and paste. And like I said before, this is why you want to set up those aliases. Because if you'll have two mutate variables in your file, well, you'll have an error. So notice over here right away, it says, hey, you already have this variable, the edit task. And therefore, in this case, I'm going to call this delete task. Then we're not looking for is done. So this is really up to you. If you want to keep it as a property in the object, you can definitely do so. In my case, I'll simplify this and I'll say task ID. So I'm only looking for this one argument, which is going to be the ID of the task. Then we can nicely remove is done. So we won't pass that data. And instead of the patch method, we want to go with delete. And this stays the same. If we're successful, yes, same deal. We want to invalidate the tasks query. And effectively, we want to refetch the latest data from the server. And also, we can access is loading. And this is the case where I'll use it. And basically, again, I'll disable that delete button while the request is taking place. So now let me look for is loading. Let's scroll down. Notice over here, we have the button, we have the on click and all that. So first, let's start with disabled. Let's set it equal to is loading while we're loading. And yes, as a side note, again, if you have multiple is loadings in one file, you'll also need to set up the aliases. Hopefully that is clear. And then where we have on click, now we want to go with our delete task function. And we want to pass in what? Well, we want to pass in the item ID, correct? So we're going to go here with item. That's our prop. And in there, I have ID property. So now let's save. Let's navigate to the browser and I can delete all of these tasks. And I'll also right away check my network responses. So one by one, notice this is my delete one. So method is delete. This is the URL and I have 200 response, which means that my request was completed successfully and then we right away refetch the latest tasks. So now one by one, I can pretty much remove all of them. And with this in place, we're pretty much done with the main functionality of the app. In following videos, I just want to showcase some additional features. All right, and once we're done with the main functionality, now let me show you how we can nicely refactor this code, effectively move it to a separate file, and as a result, our components will have even less lines of code. And I guess let's start in the app one, and I simply want to remove those default items. So we're definitely using our server, so there's no need to pass it as props, and we don't need them over here as well. So let's save that, and as I note, I have a state variable here as well. So let me remove. I don't need the use state, and I also don't need the nano ID. All right, that's an awesome start. And then let's set up a file where we'll have our custom hooks. And I'll show you how to set up get. And then I have a challenge for you. Try to set up edit, delete, as well as the create task. And I can tell you right away that the create task is going to be the trickiest one because we want to clear the value in the input. And you'll see what I'm talking about once you start working on the challenge. So first, let's create a new file. And in my case, I'm going to go with quite long one. I'm going to go with React, query, and custom hooks. And I'm going to go with JSX. And in this file, we want to set up those custom hooks. So remember, use query or use mutation is a hook. So we can either use it in the component, which we're doing right now, for example, in the form, or we can use it in another hook. And therefore, name is important and it has to start with use. And in my case, I'm going to start by setting up the custom hook to get all of the tasks. So I'll right away export since I know that I'll import in, I believe, where we were doing that in the items. As far as my name, I'm going to go with use, fetch, and tasks. So as far as parameter, we're not really looking for anything. But when it comes to logic, I want to navigate to the items and I want to grab this. So I want to grab that query. Let me take it out. And then let's navigate over here, copy and paste. And what do we want to return from this hook? Well, I want to return is loading. Also the is error, because I believe that's the one that I'm using in the items. Yep, that's the one. And also the data, correct? So this is my custom hook. And now let's go with return. And then one by one, let's pass those things. So is loading first. Then we want to pass is error. And then we also want to pass in the data. Now, of course, we don't have this use query here, correct? And we don't also have the custom fetch. So those are the two things we need to import. So let me start here with use query. That's the first one. And I also want to get the custom fetch from the utils. Now let's save. Let's navigate back to the items. And now we want to import the custom hook. So use fetch. And I believe I named it tasks. Yep. Use fetch tasks. So we don't need any more import for query. We also don't need for the custom fetch. And we simply want to go to items. Again, very, very important. Don't invoke it outside of the component. It's not going to work. And then let's go with use and fetch tasks. Let's invoke that. And now let's pull out those, I believe, three things. So we want to grab is loading. We want to grab is error. And we also want to get the data. And I believe I can just remove this one so we have effectively less lines of code. Now let's navigate. I don't think I'm going to test the error. I mean, once we can see the items, we clearly know that everything works. And pretty much you want to repeat the same steps for, again, edit, delete, and create task. Like I said, is going to be a little bit tricky because we want to clean out the input. And I guess I'm just going to start by creating those hooks. So one by one, this is not going to be use fetch tasks. I'm actually going to call the second one create task. Kind of makes sense. So create task. Then let's copy and paste. This will be, let's go with edit. Doesn't really matter. Order is totally irrelevant. And then we also want to go with use and delete task. So we have all three hooks in place, but of course we have no functionality. So then let's navigate to a single item. And I guess let's just start with this one. So let's start with the edit one. Cut it out. We want to go back to our file. Again, I'll set up the create task at the very end, and I already explained why. So first of all, let me see. I think I messed up something when I was copying. Copy, yep. Something went wrong. Let me go back over here. Let me copy this one for sure. Set it up over here. Copy and paste. Okay. So we're using mutation. So what do we need to import? Well, a hook, correct? So we're going to go here with use mutation. Then we also want to invalidate this query, correct? If we're successful. And how we can access the query client? Well, we need to import the use query client, correct? And this is one gotcha where we'll have to set up a new client instance in each of these hooks. So you cannot simply go like this. You cannot import use and then it's called query client and then go with const and then query client is equal to use query client. I mean, you can try to do so. And once you navigate back to your application in the console log, you'll have big fat error. Why? Because it's invalid hook call. So yes, since we have 4 hooks and in 3 of them, we'll use the query client and we'll invalidate the tasks query. We'll have to set up 3 instances. Now, again, this is nothing bad, but I'm just saying that we'll have to do that. So use edit task. Let's set up our query client. And now let's decide what do we want to export from this particular hook. And essentially, there's only one thing that I want to return from this custom hook, and that is edit task. So let me set up here an object, since that is still my preference, even though I'm just returning one thing, and I want to return the edit task. And while we're still in our role, let's also set up the use delete task. So now I'm going to navigate back to my single item. I'll cut this one out as well. Back to use delete task, copy and paste. I already have the use mutation import in place, so that's good. I do want to set up the instance. So let me copy and paste over here. And in this case, I want to return two things. And you know what? I'll actually give it an alias as well, just to show you how is that going to look like. So I'm going to go with delete task in my object, and also I'll right away give it an alias over here, and I'll say delete task loading. Somewhat long, but it is what it is. So delete task, and we're looking for loading. Let's save this, and now we want to go to single item, and we want to grab both of those hooks. So we don't need anymore, again, these imports. We only need imports for our delete task. So use delete task and use edit task. And since both of them are coming from the same file, I think it's only going to be one line of code. So I guess let's first start with delete task, and we also want to go with use edit task. Let's invoke both of them. And as far as what we're getting back, and you know what, since previously we had use edit task first, why don't we stay consistent? So I'll set up right away curlies, and I'll set it equal to use edit task. And in here, I just want to grab that edit task. So now this functionality should work. And now we want to do the same thing with use delete task. Let's set up the curly. So let's destructure, and we're looking for delete task, and we also want to get the loading one. So now let's navigate where we have the button. So in here we are using already delete task. We don't need to change anything there, but instead of is loading, we'll look for delete task loading. And let's finally also set up the create task. So this is my hook. I want to navigate to a form component. And you know what? I'll right away take everything, including the query client, since we won't use it here anyway. So let me cut this one out, and let me set it up here in my custom hook. As far as the imports, well, we also need a toast, correct? And like I mentioned before, this is going to be the function that creates the issue. Since, of course, in our custom hook, we don't have access to set new item name. And we have multiple approaches. Of course, we can pass it here as a parameter. That's one way how we can do that. But there's another way which we will implement, just because I want you to be aware of this option. So first of all, let's remove it. Otherwise, we'll get an error. Let's grab the toast. So back in the form, let's remove everything we're not using. So we don't need the use query. We also don't need the custom fetch, and we don't need the toast anymore. So let me remove it, and let me set it up over here. So right after the custom fetch, we'll grab the toast. So now these ones shouldn't trigger any errors. And now back in the form, let's grab that create task, and I'll show you something very, very nifty. So first of all, let's go above the handle submit. Let's go with create task. So use create and task. Let's invoke it. I believe I'm not exporting anything, so that's my bad. Let me go with return, and now we want to return create task. Also is loading, and I think that should do it. Yep. So we're only returning these two things. Let's save, and then back in the form, let's grab them right away. So is loading, and we also want to go with create task. And what's super nifty, we can set up the on success when we invoke our mutation function, our create task. And the way we do that, we go with comma, then we provide over here an object. And then inside of this object, again, we have access to onSuccess. And this is the case where I'm going to provide a function. And then inside of this function, I'll invoke set new item and we'll set it equal to an empty string. And now if everything is correct, let me navigate back. Let me refresh. Yep. Looks like everything is working. And now let's try it out. So now let me type some random task and yep, everything is correct. I have my nice toast, and I also right away display the latest data coming from the server. And then if I try to submit with an empty value, then of course I get the error. All right, and once we're done setting up the functionality in our front-end application, I also want to show you another option how we can store those items on the server. So while we were working on the project, we just used a array that we were creating every time we started the server. So for example, if I stop the server and then go with npm start, effectively, if we check the front-end application, you'll see that we'll start from the scratch. So we lose all of the data because pretty much as we're working on a project, we're just adding those items on the fly to the task list array that we have over here in the server. There's another approach where essentially we can save it to a local file system. And what that means, when we start up the server, all the items are going to be saved. So now let me showcase how we can do that. If you navigate to package.json, you'll notice this local server command. So here's what you want to do. Go to a integrated terminal, stop the server, and then go with npm run, and then local server. Now, please keep in mind your front-end application stays exactly as it is. So we don't need to do anything. The difference right now is going to be following. Once I refresh, notice I have this first and third tasks. So this is something that I probably added while I was testing. And now if I'll go with a random task, I'll nicely add it to the list. Okay, this is something we already expect. But the difference right now, if I navigate back to the server, and if I go with, again, npm run local server, you'll see that I'll have those three items in place. So once I refresh, notice I have my random task. Effectively, what that means, we don't start from scratch every time we restart the server. Now, of course, normally you'll save this to a database. And again, the result is going to be exactly the same, where every time you'll start up your server, the data is going to be already saved. But in this case, since I did not want to connect to a database, I just used the local file system.